All right, joining me right now are Jeff Lax, a law professor, as well as Karen Felicia Nancy's been with us. Jeff, let me go to you first. What are your thoughts about one? I mean, the horror that these officers are confronting when they go in there, and especially the defendant's statements to them, not necessarily confessing or admitting to a crime, despite the fact that they had been dead for a considerable period of time.
Horribly gruesome, obviously difficult to hear this kind of things. Just a terrible, terrible incident. But you're going to hear a lot of this type of testimony from officers. And it was a kind of a bumbling investigation at first by the officers because they failed to give them the Miranda warnings properly. So they had to go back and get the same confession again. But fortunately, there is a lot in the evidence about these confessions because they were made multiple times. And I guess I'm not sure about the timeline, but perhaps the days and hours after he was arrested. But yeah, difficult to listen to. But you're going to hear a lot of these types of statements that you just heard from officers talking about the confessions.
Yeah, and Jeff, let me ask you.
Have a what? Remember the admonitions?
All right, Karen, what do you think so far of the defense closing statement?
Jeff, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff.
I thought she left. No problem.
You know, the ghost of Karen is still here. Jeff, I apologize.
I got it wrong last time, so no problem. Well, you know, it was interesting when you saw the judge. I've never seen a judge use the bell to save himself before, but in that case, it seemed like we cut in a little bit late, but it seemed like the prosecution was objecting to Mr. Baez trying to introduce evidence that was not an evidence, something that was not an evidence, I meant to say. And by the way, Mr. Baez has been pushing the envelope throughout his closing, trying to sneak evidence in there, or sneak information, I should say, in there that is not an evidence. You know, he said he actually made some inflammatory comments about the prosecution. He actually at one point said that they were trying to mislead the jury. You can't do that. That's not an evidence. That's inflammatory. It's prejudicial. The prosecution objected. The judge properly excluded that. And now you see Mr. Baez trying to do that again by saying, look, you didn't ask the nurse this. You didn't ask the nurse that. You were scared to hear their answer. And again, the prosecution is objecting, and the judge saved himself with the bell because these are close calls, because it's not an evidence. You're allowed to talk about what's not in evidence. So I think Mr. Baez did a good job here, and the judge didn't want to deal with it anymore, so they took a break.
Yeah, let's get to that principle. In most states, every state's a little bit different, but they talk about you can convict somebody on the evidence or find them not guilty on the evidence, or also the defense can argue that there's a lack of evidence, like something that you would have expected to hear that you didn't hear from the witnesses. So I kind of feel that that's fair game in the case when they're talking about what you didn't hear, as well as all the things that he's arguing the police should have done to preserve information that would have been much better than their anecdotal piecing of things together afterwards. And then lastly, Professor, interestingly, he's talking about how the police were not the first ones to speak to these witnesses. Many of them went to lawyers, and then afterwards they went there to speak to them, which could go to bias. And certainly as a former homicide prosecutor that investigated cases, we want to talk to those witnesses before anybody else has had a chance to talk to them. Thoughts on all that?
Yeah, so I have paragraphs of notes here just from the closing. But one of the things I wrote down here, and I think this was the shining moment for Mr. Baez, because I want to read this quote to you that I have written here. He said these, quote, witnesses have civil cases, and that's where this case belongs, because there is no evidence of intent to kill. That's the entire crux of the defense here. There is no evidence of intent to kill. And this case, now, listen, Mr. Husel, Dr. Husel may not like the fact that his lawyer is saying this case should be in civil court. He probably doesn't believe it should be in civil court either. That's a different conversation. But that, in terms of the criminal investigation, that was a shining moment. I think he should be actually hammering that point home more. He said it once so far. I would like to hear that again and again, and combine that with what is evidence about Dr. Husel taking efforts to save some of these same patients. You know, I have not heard one word yet from Mr. Baez about the patients, and there is evidence of this, the life-saving treatment that Dr. Husel gave them. Where is that in that closing? I hope it's coming. Maybe he'll close with that, end the closing with that. But I'd like to hear more of that. Instead of talking about, you mentioned the police investigation, this is not that kind of case. This is not the typical murder, you know, in the heat of the moment case. So I don't think these jurors want to hear about mistakes by the police investigation. I don't think the police bumbling or whatever little things they did wrong is an issue here. I think they want to hear about the patient by patient accounts of why Dr. Husel did this and the fact that there's no evidence of intent to kill.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it seemed like he kind of went over. He may get back to it quickly, but that was also consistent with a lot of the state's witnesses who thought that the doctor was an excellent doctor and did everything he could for his patient. So, maybe he will be emphasizing that down the road, Professor. But let's listen to a Professor, I want to pick up something that we were talking about before. What I found also curious about the physics of this particular trial was that many of the state's witnesses provided actual character evidence for Dr. Husel. And again, in most states, and we don't know what the judge is going to charge here, jurors could take character evidence into consideration, not only with respect to whether it's consistent with that character, but moreover, they could find somebody not guilty based on character evidence alone in the state of New Jersey. I don't know what it's like in that state. But did you find that to be an unusual dynamic that many of the state's witnesses were supportive of Dr. Husel?
For sure. You heard, I think it was 53 witnesses. You've talked about this for weeks, Bob, about how many witnesses the prosecution has brought. The defense only brought one witness because, quite frankly, there was really nobody left. I mean, who was the prosecution going to bring at that point? And you make a good point. Who was the defense going to bring at that point? But you make an excellent point that the prosecution brought plenty of witnesses that were not good for them and who testified to Dr. Husel's sparkling reputation. There's never been any wrongdoing brought against him for anything that we heard in the evidence. And when people were asked about it, they've confirmed that. So yeah, that is highly relevant. But yes, to your point, it's of course very unusual for the prosecution's own witnesses to be giving so much testimony that really supports the defense, which definitely happened in this case.
Yeah, Professor, as well as I do, that somewhere down the line when they were looking into this case of whether to charge, and of course, let's not forget they charged 25 initially and then dropped 11 of those cases, which I've always said is very sloppy to me. You're in a room and you're making a decision as to whether to prosecute or not prosecute. You have your team with you, and they start off at 25, it gets knocked down to 14. No. Professor, I only got about 45 seconds left. So far, what do you think of the points that the defense is scoring, or the jury, in your mind, going to be affected by them positively?
Yeah, this is the theme we heard throughout the trial, that these were patients who were not well coming into the hospital. They were very ill. And earlier in the closing, Mr. Baez made the comment that how can you say that Dr. Husel hastened the patient's death when there's not one shred of evidence in this trial brought by the prosecution as to how long they thought they had to live. And that's compelling. Now, the prosecution doesn't have to prove that. They don't have to demonstrate how long the patients had to live. But nevertheless, as you've been saying, the jury's hearing this, they're taking it to heart, and it's effective.
Okay, Professor. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for us. It's going to be a fascinating case to see what this jury is going to do with this case. It has a lot of implications. That's it for me. I'll be back Thursday.